This, my dear readers, or perhaps I should say dear listeners, is not a love story. At least, not exactly. It is a story of maybe love, and maybe is sometimes far more interesting than certainty. Our story begins in Caroline's 44th year. Although, if we are being technically correct, perhaps we should say she re-met Philip that year. Is that even English? Re-met? Let's go with it. Because you see, Philip had appeared in Carolina's life twice before. The first time when she was a young teenager. She remembers almost nothing about that meeting except knowing his name. Or perhaps knowing of him. The second time was in her 30s, at the home of mutual friends James and Wendy, after the birth of their first baby. At the time, Caroline was not living for the Lord and was entangled in what the modern world calls a situationship. A word that sounds far more glamorous than it deserves. She remembered Philip from that evening, remembered thinking he seemed kind, thoughtful, quiet in a room full of loud conversations. She thought about him occasionally after that, then less often, then not at all. Life, as it often does, moved on. Years passed. Then, in her 43rd year, something strange happened. Caroline had a dream. Philip appeared in it. Not dramatically, not romantically, just there. And when she woke up, she couldn't stop thinking about him for days, then weeks. At one point, she even did what many of us have done in moments of curiosity and mild desperation. She searched for him online. She even made chat an entirely innocent bystander, an unwilling accomplice in the investigation. Eventually, she found him on LinkedIn. But by that time, Caroline had made a promise to God. She had told him quite clearly, "If you want me married, you will arrange it." And in Caroline's very old-fashioned opinion, a woman hunting down a man on LinkedIn was definitely not part of the divine plan. So she closed the tab. She moved on. Eventually, the thoughts faded. Again, life continued. Which brings us to that morning in her 44th year, a morning that began far too early. You see, Caroline worked remotely. Her schedule was the opposite of everyone else's. She worked while the world slept, and slept while the world worked. So when the phone rang at 8 a.m., she had just finished her work and was fully prepared to go to bed. But the call was about showing an apartment. Caroline wasn't an agent, but sometimes life handed her little responsibilities like this. On that particular morning, she wished very much that she had hired someone else to do it. Instead, there she was. Dressed in a soft peach sundress, her hair swept up in a quick updo, heading out the door while the rest of the city was just waking up. Before driving to the apartment, she stopped at her usual coffee shop. She needed caffeine. Desperately. She pushed open the door, and that was when she saw him. Philip stood just ahead of her in line, white t-shirt, blue jeans, navy cap, a cup of coffee already in his hand. And when their eyes met, they both stopped walking. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then Philip smiled slightly and said 3 words. "There you are." Caroline knew why she was staring, but the more puzzling question was, why was he? Did he remember her? As soon as the words left his mouth, Caroline instinctively turned around to see who he was speaking to. Surely he meant someone behind her. Philip chuckled softly. "I'm talking to you." "I saw you here about a month ago," he said. "I tried asking about you, but they wouldn't tell me anything." He gestured toward the cafe staff. Caroline smiled and waved at them. "She came there often." Philip went on. "I even tried to follow you out once, but you disappeared." Philip extended his hand. "I'm Fi." "Hi, Philip," she said. He blinked. "You know me?" "Kind of." She hesitated before continuing. "We met years ago at James and Wendy's place, after their first baby was born." Recognition lit his face. "No way." Then he smiled. The kind of smile that carries a small amount of disbelief. "Would you like to sit down and have coffee?" he asked. Caroline glanced at the time. "I would love to," she said, but I'm actually running late to show a house." At that moment, she turned toward the counter. "The usual, please," she said to the barista. Then she looked back at Philip. "My name is Caroline." "Nice to officially meet you." Philip watched her walk toward the counter. Something told him this meeting was not the end of the story. When she turned to leave with her coffee, he spoke again. "I'd like to see the house too." Caroline burst out laughing, but for reasons she didn't entirely understand, she replied, "Okay." "Did you drive here?" Caroline asked. Philip nodded. "Yes," he said, then lifted his car keys slightly. "But we can take my car. I'll drive you." Caroline tilted her head for a moment, considering the proposal. Now, under normal circumstances, accepting a ride from a man she had just met in a coffee shop might have required more caution, but this was not exactly a man she had just met. This was Philip, a man she had encountered 3 separate times across the strange timeline of her life. A man whose name had once appeared in a dream. A man she had searched for online, and then deliberately decided not to pursue, and here he was, standing in a Nairobi coffee shop on an ordinary morning that had begun with nothing more romantic than sleep deprivation and the need for caffeine. So, Caroline did what many sensible people occasionally do. She ignored common sense. She shrugged lightly. Why not? Philip smiled, clearly pleased by this development. They walked together toward the parking area, the early Nairobi sun already warming the morning air. The city was fully awake now. Matatus roared past in bursts of music and color. Street vendors were arranging fruit displays. Office workers hurried along sidewalks with takeaway coffee cups in hand. Life, in other words, was proceeding exactly as normal, which made it even stranger that something about this morning felt quietly significant. Philip unlocked his car and opened the passenger door for her. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Well," she said, amused, "aren't we polite?" "My mother raised me right," Philip replied. She laughed and climbed in. The drive began with the kind of polite conversation 2 people usually have when they are still figuring each other out. Traffic, the neighborhood, the weather. But within minutes, something shifted. The conversation began to flow, naturally, easily, effortlessly. They talked about the coffee shop. Caroline confessed she practically lived there. Philip admitted he had only recently started going. "About a month ago," he said. Caroline glanced sideways at him. "A month?" she said slowly. "That's when you saw me." Philip nodded. Caroline laughed softly. Then the conversation drifted elsewhere. They talked about how strange it was that their paths had crossed 3 times across different decades of life. Teenagers, 30-somethings, now 40-somethings. 40-somethings almost as if God had been quietly arranging small intersections. Little reminders, tiny nudges, not enough to form a story, just enough to leave a memory. Caroline leaned back in the seat, thoughtful. "It's funny," she said. "What is? How people appear in your life at different times." Philip nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "And sometimes," she added, "you don't realize the pattern until much later." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The car continued through the Nairobi streets. Sunlight filtered through the windshield, and the conversation resumed, about nothing, and about everything, about work, about mutual friends, about how the city had changed over the years, about the strange realization that 2 people who barely knew each other somehow felt perfectly comfortable talking. It felt less like meeting someone new, and more like continuing a conversation that had simply been paused for several years. Eventually, Philip turned into the street where the apartment building stood. "Well," he said, parking the car, "let's go see this mysterious house I invited myself to." Caroline shook her head. "You know," she said, "most people schedule viewings." "Most people," Philip replied, "don't run into someone from 3 separate chapters of their life in a coffee shop." She considered this. Fair point. They stepped out of the car, neither of them realizing that this ordinary little drive was the beginning of something neither had expected. After the apartment viewing, Philip drove Caroline back to the coffee shop parking garage. The viewing itself had been fairly quick. Carolyn had met the actual prospective tenant at the building entrance and walked them through the apartment while Philip lingered quietly nearby. He mostly stayed out of the way, occasionally wandering toward the balcony, looking out the windows, nodding politely as Caroline described the features of the place to the person who had genuinely come to see it. At one point, she caught him trying very hard not to smile. Later, when the viewing ended and the prospective tenant left, Philip leaned slightly toward her. "I feel like I should apologize," he said. "For what?" Caroline asked. "For inviting myself to an apartment viewing I had absolutely no reason to attend." Carolyn laughed. "You know," she said, "most people would just ask someone if they want to have coffee." Philip considered this. "True," he admitted, "but this felt more creative." "Well," she replied, "I appreciate the creativity." They walked back to the car together. The drive back to the coffee shop parking garage was relaxed and easy. The conversation drifted from one topic to another, the way it often does when two people are unexpectedly comfortable in each other's company. When they arrived, Carolyn climbed out of the car. "Well," she said, lifting her coffee cup slightly in farewell, "thanks for the ride." "Any time," Philip replied. She got into her car. Philip waited until she had pulled out of the garage before leaving himself. Carolyn drove off toward her parents' home. Philip headed toward his own estate, or so he thought, because about 15 minutes later, as Philip turned into the entrance of his neighborhood, something caught his attention. The car ahead of him looked familiar. Very familiar. Same color. Same shape. Even the same small dent near the bumper. Philip leaned forward slightly. "No way," he murmured. The car ahead slowed, then turned left. Philip turned left too. The car parked. Philip parked as well. Both drivers stepped out of their cars at exactly the same moment. Caroline froze. Philip stared for half a second. Then he burst out laughing. "I promise I'm not stalking you." Caroline blinked in disbelief. "You live here?" Philip nodded. "Yeah." She looked around. "Well," she said slowly, "that's convenient." I stood there in the parking area, both still slightly stunned, or perhaps, depending on one's worldview, not a coincidence at all. "Do you live here?" Caroline asked. Philip nodded. "Yeah, been here a few years. And you?" Carolyn shifted her bag slightly on her shoulder. "I moved back in with my parents recently." Philip raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Temporary arrangement," she explained, "while I sort out a few things." "What kind of things?" Caroline hesitated. Then she said it. "I'm waiting for my visa." Philip frowned slightly. "Visa?" She nodded. "I'm moving to Portugal." The words hung in the air between them. Portugal. Not exactly next door. Philip leaned lightly against his car. "Wow," he said quietly. "When?" "Soon," Caroline replied. "As soon as the paperwork comes through." He nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because suddenly the strange excitement of their unexpected reunion had acquired a quiet complication. Time. Or rather, a lack of it. "Well," Philip said eventually, forcing a small smile, "that's quite an adventure." Carolyn smiled back. "Yes," she said. But something in her voice suggested that adventure wasn't the only emotion involved. Life, however, has a curious habit of continuing, even when the future has already begun rearranging itself. Over the next few weeks, Carolyn and Philip saw each other often. Not intentionally, at least not at first. It began with coffee. Naturally. The same coffee shop, the same line, the same quiet smiles of recognition. Sometimes Philip arrived first. Sometimes Caroline did. Eventually, they stopped pretending the meetings were accidental. "Are we scheduling this now?" Caroline asked one morning. Philip shrugged. "I prefer to think of it as strategic coincidence." From coffee, the meetings expanded. walks through nearby streets, conversations that began casually and slowly deepened. They talked about work, family, faith, old memories, new plans, and occasionally about Portugal. Those conversations always carried a slightly different tone, not sad, but thoughtful, like two people aware that a clock somewhere was quietly ticking. Some evenings they walked until the city lights flickered on. Other nights they talked in the coffee shop until the staff began politely stacking chairs. Midnight arrived more than once without either of them noticing. There was laughter, plenty of it. Philip had a dry sense of humor Carolyn hadn't expected. Carolyn, meanwhile, had the ability to turn even ordinary moments into stories. But beneath the easy conversations lived an unspoken awareness. Carolyn was leaving, and neither of them quite knew what to do with that fact. Eventually, the email arrived. The visa had been approved. Caroline stared at the message on her laptop screen for a long time. This was what she had been working toward, planning, praying, preparing. And now it was real. She packed her life into suitcases over the following days. Clothes, books, memories. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and quiet concern. Philip helped once, carrying a box of books to her car. Neither of them mentioned the obvious question, what happens next? On the morning of her flight, Philip offered to drive her to the airport. The Nairobi traffic was unusually light. Or perhaps it only felt that way because neither of them was paying much attention to the road. The conversation stayed comfortably neutral. Travel plans, airline food, Portuguese weather, small topics, safe topics. At the departure drop-off, Philip lifted her suitcases from the trunk. Caroline looked at him. "Well," she said softly. "Well," he replied. Neither of them spoke about what might have been, or what still might be, because sometimes the beginning of something is too fragile for grand declarations. Distance, after all, is a strange test for something that has barely begun. Caroline hugged him lightly, then turned toward the terminal. Caroline waved goodbye at the airport, her heart a mixture of excitement and ache. Philip stood quietly beside the curb, watching as she walked toward the entrance. For a moment she turned back, raised her hand, smiled, then disappeared inside. Philip remained where he was for several seconds, watching the place where she had just been. The image of her in the soft peach dress seemed almost permanently fixed in his mind. Eventually, he climbed back into his car. The drive home felt strangely quiet. They had no plan, no schedule, no promises. And yet every moment they had shared over the past weeks had carried a quiet sense of meaning, as though something important had happened, even if neither of them could quite define it yet. Philip leaned back in the driver's seat before starting the engine. Maybe this isn't the end, he murmured to himself. Months passed. Nairobi continued its usual rhythm of traffic, coffee shops, and late afternoon rains. Carolyn, meanwhile, was learning a new life in Portugal. New streets, a new language, the smell of the ocean drifting through open windows. Somewhere between two continents and several time zones, the story of Caroline and Philip simply waited. Because life has a way of bringing people back to places they never expected to return to. And perhaps one day, whether in Nairobi, Portugal, or some city neither of them had planned for, two familiar faces might meet again. Maybe with another cup of coffee, maybe with another smile, and maybe, just maybe, this time the story would begin a little differently. But here's what we know. We know that Carolyn found the life she had prayed for, that she sat at Portuguese cafe tables with her laptop and her coffee, building something new with the quiet determination of a woman who had always known how to begin again, that the ocean was exactly as beautiful as she had imagined, that she was happy. And yet there are things that stay with a person. 3 words said on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a Nairobi coffee shop. The particular way someone laughs at their own dry jokes. The strange comfort of a conversation that feels like a continuation rather than a beginning. We know that Philip still went to the coffee shop, that he still occasionally sat near the window, that the door still caught his attention sometimes in a way it hadn't before that morning. And we know this. God, who had arranged 3 quiet introductions across 3 different decades, was not in a hurry. He never is. So the story of Carolyn and Philip remains exactly what it was always meant to be: unfinished, patient, and full of the very best kind of possibility. The kind that doesn't need to rush. Because some stories don't end. They simply wait for the right moment, the right city, the right morning. And perhaps one day, somewhere in the world, a familiar door will open, and someone will look up and smile and say those 3 words again. There you are. She closed the LinkedIn tab. She told God, "If you want me married, you arrange it." And then she went about her life. Sometimes the divine plan doesn't look like a plan at all. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary Tuesday morning in a Nairobi coffee shop. And sometimes it looks like a story that doesn't end neatly, that simply waits, patient, unfinished, full of the very best kind of possibility. This is Written by Grace, Faith, and Forever Stories, a place for stories that remind you God is still writing quietly, faithfully, better than anything we could arrange ourselves. Subscribe. Share this with someone whose story is still being written.